Nothing pleased Vidal more than the opportunity to talk about his work, especially when he could do it around the dinner table with his children as a captive audience. But as he was about to give his son an itinerary of the next 5 to 6 years, a knock at the door startled Vidal, as if a tremor had shaken the table. With his feast laid out, he felt as exposed and unprepared as if someone was calling on him to answer the door while he bathed. A Sabbath dinner was not forbidden in Granada. Indeed, if a neighbor called on them, they would think nothing of the sight. But as curfew was in effect and no Jews wandered the streets after dark, he deduced that it must be a soldier or official from the city, someone in need of a physician at best, someone who smelled the oil of their cooking at worst. If a Catholic looked upon their ritual, they'd view it as exotic, perhaps even a rebellion against the crown. He ordered his children to extinguish the candles, and Eliezer licked his fingers to snuff out the wicks with saliva. At the other end of the room, Bonadonna picked up the glass vial of cooking oil that rested on the stone counter beside the hearth and threw it out the window. 8 reales worth of oil shattered on the ground outside. The knock came from the door again, louder and more insistent. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he could tell Bonadonna was looking from the hearth to the window, debating whether to throw the food out as well. It would assure that nobody could prove that they'd cooked with oil. But as the Sabbath dictated that they perform no work until the following sunset, they would have nothing to eat until the next sundown. He ultimately gestured for Bonadonna to keep the cauldron where it was. Even if the caller saw no food, the smell would linger. From the door came the sound of a man's voice. "Signor Harofa! Signor Harofa! It's Gabriel!" The voice of Catalina's husband was as welcome a sound as music. He patted the sweat off his forehead and ordered Asher to open the door. Gabriel stood at the threshold, out of breath and sweating in the cold night. His smooth blonde hair, usually combed and well kept, fell over his face. He cradled a furled parchment in his hand like a baton. Vidal invited Gabriel inside, and once his eyes seemed to adjust to the darkness, Gabriel looked at the plates of stew on the table, a banquet for many by the standards of post-war Granada, and apologized for his intrusion. "No apology necessary," Vidal said. "Sit with us. We have meat and bread." "Signor Harofa, if I could speak with you in private." "Is something wrong?" Bonadonna asked. "Is Catalina well?" "No, Suegra, your daughter is well. Signor Harofa, do not think me brazen, but we must speak at once. Might this wait for another time? We are in the middle of dinner." "I see that, but it will only take a moment." If the situation was reversed, if Vidal needed an audience with Gabriel, he could not imagine interrupting the boy's prayer at church. He had half a mind to dismiss the interruption and send the boy away. But the trembling in Gabriel's voice, and the way sweat trickled down his temples on a cool March night, gave Vidal the same feeling in his stomach as when he'd watched the new monarchs parade. "Bonita, take the children outside and sing to them." "Gabriel, what is happening?" Bonadonna asked. "I'm sorry, Signora Harofa, but if I may speak with your husband." Bonadonna detested the practice of forcing a wife outside when company called on a husband. That Gabriel interrupted the Sabbath would give her all the more reason to protest. But she seemed to sense, as Vidal did, that something must be very wrong. Gabriel came from a good Catholic family. He was not raised to intrude without notice. She instructed the children to follow her into the courtyard. Vidal allowed Eliezer to stay, but when Asher made the same request, Bonadonna dragged him out by the wrist. "Why, father?" Asher asked. "With the women?" "You are not a man yet," Eliezer said. "Not until Elul," Vidal added. Bonadonna closed the wooden door to the courtyard behind her. Through the shuttered windows came the sound of her singing, La Prima Vez. La prima vez que te vidi, de tus ojos me enamoré. De aquel momento te amé, fina la tomba te amaré. At the table, Gabriel unfurled the parchment, weighing down the four ends with pewter Kiddush cups and silver Shabbat candlesticks. There have been many rumors in Bib Ramla that the king and queen issued a new decree. I did not wish to alarm you with gossip, but I found this flyer being handed out by the nuns at our church steps and could not wait to warn you. Can we have a little light? We cannot. Signor Harofa, please. We cannot light the candles. I saw light from beneath your doorstep when I knocked. They were lit, but we extinguished them. We cannot relight them. Gabriel offered such a bewildered expression that Vidal wondered if the boy ever bothered to learn about his wife's faith before her conversion. The Sabbath not only forbade Vidal from reigniting the candles, but from asking another to light them on his behalf. You understand, we were doing more than eating our Friday supper. I know what the Sabbath is, and I know it can be broken in the event of an emergency. And is this such an occasion? I believe it is. Vidal reignited the candles with the flame from the hearth. Firelight bathed a parchment written in Castilian calligraphy that bore the signings of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, and an impression of the seal of the monarchs in fresh black wax. As Vidal's eyesight lacked the ability to see in the dim light, he asked his son to read it aloud. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, Eliza read, by the grace of God, King and Queen of Castile, Leon, Aragon, Sicily, Granada. Yes, we know all that. To all the Jews and all individual Jews of these places, salutations and grace. They address us? We have been informed that in these our kingdoms there were some wicked Christians who Judaized and apostatized our holy Catholic faith. Eliza continued to read accusations made by the monarchs that Jews circumcised Christian children, fed Christians meat from ritualistic slaughters, and convinced Christians that there was no way but the law of Moses. The words argued that the perversion had caused great harm to the Catholic faith, leaving the monarchs no alternative but to banish all Jews from their kingdoms. We resolve to order the said Jews and Jewesses of our kingdoms to depart and never to return, by the end of the month of July next of the present year, under pain that if they do not perform and comply with this command, they incur the penalty of death. The threat against his family would have sent Vidal into a fury if the decree did not leave him in disbelief. This could not be the truth. It must be some sort of joke. The Articles of Capitulation swore to protect them against this exact outcome. Passover was less than a month away. Might this be the monarch's way of fooling their new subjects in honor of the upcoming holiday? A holiday their Christ had once practiced as well? Gabriel said he'd received the decree given out by the nuns on the steps of the church. What sort of nun distributed decrees handed down by royalty? Vidal brought his eyes down to the parchment, and the heat of the flames danced before his scalp. What sense am I to make of this decree? Jews have dwelled in all the kingdoms of Ferdinand and Isabella for nearly 20 years, centuries longer under their predecessors. Why force us out the moment they acquire Granada? It says right here, Father, because we circumcised their children. Who would believe such a lie? My father knows clerics who work closely with the king, Gabriel said. We could arrange for you to stay, all of you. You would only need to convert. They do not wish to expel anyone, especially a skilled physician. They only wish for people to cease spreading the law of Moses. Who is spreading such a law? When have any of us tried to convert any of you? I am suggesting a possibility. Did I ask you to convert when you married my daughter? Did she? We Jews don't partake in such aggressive tactics. That is why we live in La Juderia. We keep to ourselves. Eliza acted as a shield to protect Gabriel from Vidal. Father, please, we could have read this on a signpost on the way to temple tomorrow. Instead, he came to tell us. He wants to help. Vidal attempted to compose himself, but he could no longer remain naive to the reality that this decree was as official as the seal it bore. It loitered in his house, rested on his table, and carried the threat of death against his family. A threat made by foreign invaders who had done nothing to learn of the kingdom they'd conquered. The fate of his family made no difference to the monarchs. This threat was merely one step of many in their quest to conquer the peninsula. He remembered his conversation with Catalina the day the monarchs paraded into the city. Even the Catholics of Granada had known nothing about this promise, this undisguised hypocrisy, before this decree appeared. He could not fathom the idea of leaving Granada. He'd never gone far beyond the city walls and knew of nobody to go to and nowhere else to live. But to convert sounded equally impossible. God had blessed him with a brilliant mind, skilled hands to perform a respected profession, a grand house, beautiful children. To give up his faith would be the same as turning his back on God and all the fortunes he'd blessed upon him. Bonadonna called from the other side of the door to ask if they were finished, and Gabriel declared that he needed to be off. "No, my son is right. I blame you for none of this. Stay, break bread with us." "Thank you, Signor Haurofa, but I must be getting back to my family." He requested that Vidal come to his house in the morning. "Perhaps you should bring Catalina the news." "I will go to you after temple. And I will instruct my mother to leave the door open, so your Sabbath is not broken further." Sabbath had no rules about opening doors, but educating Gabriel in the practices of his faith was the least of Vidal's concerns. Gabriel returned to the dark alleyway outside their door, and his clothes blew in the wind tunnel created by the narrow neighborhood streets. The chill of the night air reached into the house, cold and moist when it made contact with the sweat that covered Vidal's neck and armpits. Being a physician made him perturbed by many aspects of life, but living without a home was never one of them. He was born with a roof over his head and expected to die with a roof over his head. That he or his family might live without a home had never before struck him as a possibility. After he thanked Gabriel and shut the door, Bonadonna returned from the courtyard. "What is going on in here? Why have the candles been relit?" In a most uncommon change of practices, Vidal allowed their children to eat dinner in their bedchambers while he and Bonadonna sat over the decree so that she could read the monarch's words before the candles thawed into melted wax. "It cannot be," she said. "We have lived here our whole lives. Our parents are buried here. Sarah, I know, if we leave, we say farewell to her bones forever. But if we leave, where do we go? Portugal is the last kingdom in the peninsula not under their rule. Portuguese is a difficult language to learn. Perhaps Italy. Our tongues are more similar. We would need to go through Aragon, Francia. We would never get there by August. Perhaps a boat? I hear they are dangerous. All of us on a boat? What if it sinks? Perhaps we should consider the alternative. Convert? Bonita, for you to make this suggestion so casually, we have not even explored our options." "What options, Vidal? All of our options are right here in front of us. We cannot leave Granada. We've lived here our whole lives. Our home is here. Your patients are here." "And what of my Jewish patients? They will be leaving as well. Our faith will not protect us in a new country any more than it can here. We'd have nowhere to live and not a coin to our names. We cannot do this to the children. We cannot raise them Catholic either. It's already worked for one of our daughters. Catalina seems content." Bonadonna came from a devout Jewish family. Her father, an accountant, had managed the finances of the synagogue. Once she became a mother, she tutored the children in Hebrew after school, kept a kosher home, and always woke earliest on Sabbath morning to prepare the children for service. For her to suggest giving up everything at the first sign of a threat made Vidal question if he knew his wife of 19 years as well as he'd assumed. If she was not a Jew, who was she? "My wife, how am I hearing this from you? I don't want to convert any more than you do, but this is the only option that makes sense for our family." "I disagree. I see many options. It is dangerous outside these walls. At least in Granada, we know what threats exist. Our children are safest in our home, not in the wilderness." Vidal understood her rationale. He'd never ventured far beyond Granada's walls, and did not know what sort of landscape nor bandits might dwell outside civilization to bring harm to a family of traveling Jews. But to convert? To turn away from his faith? It would not only force him to go against everything he believed and stood for, but bring new dangers as well. There had been talk several years ago of the slaughter and drowning of conversos in a river in Toledo, proof to him that it was safer to remain a Jew than convert. He needed to make a choice, but the decree offered no options that would ensure his family's safety. It shamed him that if this were a matter of a patient's ailment, he'd know the solution within moments, but with his family's lives at stake, he saw no clear solution. When the other fathers of Granada learned of this decree, would they feel the same? Tomorrow we'll go to temple, and there we'll find our answer. If the entire community is to leave, then I think it is wise to leave with them. And if they think it is wiser to stay, to suggest we apostatize minutes after learning of the decree, I dare not speak the words. They finished their dinner in silence. As he lay on their straw bed in the dark that night and listened to the belabored snores of a woman who'd eaten too soon before sleeping, he recalled a story his father had once told him. When he was 10 years old, he had spent the day exploring Granada with his friends. He looked up at the Nasrid Great Mosque and La Alhambra and envied the Moorish buildings for their extravagant size and architecture, much grander than his school or synagogue. When he came home, he went to his father's table, the same table where the decree still lay, and asked why the Moors' buildings were so much grander than the Jews'. Because we live in an Islamic nation. Why don't we live in a Jewish nation? No such place has existed for nearly 1,500 years. His father told him the story of the Roman invasion of Jerusalem, the destruction of the Second Temple, and the banishment of the Jews from the city. How a small band of Jews sailed from the easternmost banks of the Mediterranean Sea and settled among the Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. The peninsula became our home, and our ancestors have prospered in the city of Granada for more than a millennium. The sentence echoed in Vidal's mind over the sound of Bonadonna's snores. He looked up at a bedroom ceiling enshrouded in darkness. More than a millennium, and now they would be banished again.